Hello, listeners. In the previous session, we discussed about the few key concepts about the gender analysis, and also we discussed about the emergence of gender and development as an approach, as a theory, as a discipline, and related to the how this gender analysis related to the discipline of gender studies, women studies, and gender and development studies. And we will continue the key concepts. After explaining the key concepts by myself and my colleague Dr. Sunita Dal, we will explain what is gender analysis, how this feminist and other women rights activists develop the framework for policy making and analysis, few frameworks like gender blind and other frameworks. After that, we will discuss about the frameworks related to the gender analysis. I'll start with explaining there are two key concepts related to the gender analysis. One is the practical gender needs, another one is the strategic gender needs.
It's very important.
These two concepts are very important with related to gender analysis. First, before we discuss what is practical and strategic gender needs, we need to understand what is needs. Like us in the previous session, Dr. Sunita Dal explained, like when she explained the concept gender, she explained that men and women, they perform certain activities in the society. So while performing certain activities, both men and women, their needs also differs based on their activities. Performance. For example, if the women, if they are expected to perform the certain productive and reproductive activities, so their needs also differs according to their activities. For example, if the women, if they expected to do reproductive activities include the taking care of the children, elderly, and also they perform certain activities in the household. For example, the women are expected to ensure the water and food in the household. So the practical gender needs basically talks about the day-to-day survival of the human beings in the society. For example, day-to-day survival for the women is that like they have to ensure their food, shelter, clothing, and these are the basic important survival. And these needs basically the women are expected to fulfill these needs by the society, by the family. So when if they are not able to fulfill these needs, and their survival is, it's big question.
They can be questioned by the household
members. That is the
so
very
whether
important.
a woman stops in the home or in a family, but she is expected to provide food, water, fuel to the
to taking care of the elderly, children, all these activities. So practical gender needs is basically, it's like the needs of the day-to-day survival. So the women are performing all these activities. So these are their needs.
And how we can ensure the practical
gender needs. For example, now the government of India massively implementing the water and sanitation. Otherwise, like now also only 60% of the households in India, especially in rural areas, they have the protected water, and still most of the families, they lack the toilet facilities. So for example, toilet facilities, the women, they have to, it's toilet facilities related to their health. So they have to either have to access or walk so many kilometers early morning before sunrise or after the sunset. Okay, so they have to walk. Water also, protected drinking water, like sometimes even we can see in the many news and all, some women, they have to walk 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers to fetch the water. So it has, so these like a
even for fuelwood also, Veena Agarwal's extensively studied, like for fuelwood, how women, they walk
go to the forest
3-4 kilometers per day
they collect the fuel, they come
collect the
back,
fuel.
and then they prepare the food for the entire family. So that is, so policies, the government, they make sure that they have to formulate the policies to address the needs of the basic survival needs of the women and other marginalized. So these basic survival needs are called the practical gender needs. Once you address the practical gender needs, strategic gender needs is basically, it will alter the gender relations. Once you address the status, like you have explained the difference between the access and control. You see that women, they may have an access to certain things.
Land, for example, but they do not have ownership over the land.
So if you start owning the land, there if you start their economic, if they improve their economic activities, if they control over the resources, they automatically, according to the studies and feminists, their status will improve. Then status will improve means they start questioning the existing gender relations that may lead to altering the gender relations.
So, maybe Uma,
strategic gender needs is to address these gender relations.
So particularly, I think the purpose of gender analysis is to to bring about empowerment, and here empowerment is not given. Right, empowerment is something that is self-generated, and that can only be achieved once the strategic gender needs have been addressed.
That is true. That is, you are absolutely correct. So the strategic gender needs are the needs can be addressed. Resulted, it will alter the gender relations, and automatically they will get empowered. Empowerment is the basically, it is like empowered means they can independently take decisions and they can control over their own lives as well as lives of their other members in the family and the society. That is called the empowerment. So strategic gender needs are the needs which may leads to change in the gender relations in the among men
within
and women
the household.
Within household as well as in the society
Also.
So like
violence against women, like addressing the violence can be an example of strategic
gender needs. And access and control over the resource, land as a resource. So once they control over the resource, then they can question, and their status will improve in the society. Okay, so control over economic resources, addressing the violence, these are the, and also bringing certain laws that may alter the gender relations. So policy makers, they think that first they need to address the practical gender needs. Once they fulfill the practical gender needs, then they can able to address the strategic gender needs. That is what. So this is part of the gender analysis
framework
or
the
key concepts. So would you able to explain few more key concepts related to the gender analysis?
Yes, one of the concept is status and role, right? So status is talks about the invisible power relations that has been shared by women and men within the household.
Okay.
So we know that which means that that is certainly a power dynamics which works, like who earns, who owes the land, then who takes the decision about the children's education, who spends the money and how money should be spent within the household, right? So which means that there is a invisible power which embedded in the household, and this determines determines the status.
Okay.
Like who has a lower status vis-a-vis the other gender. So that is, and role is status determines the activities performed by women and men, whether it is in the household or in the market also. Many women are into flexi wage, low paid wage,
informal sector,
unorganized, they are into unorganized sector, right? So informal labor, they work primarily as contractual labor. labor. So this is the role that they play. So the reproductive role is also been seen as a invisible labor, and the same notion has been translated in the market. Even if women, they participate in the market, but still they are in the low
paid jobs,
or
and
they
without
get
any social security.
like remember, like in the construction sectors, both women and men, they are working, but the moment you ask about their wages, but men are getting higher wages compared to women.
Actually, after like even sometimes they both of them, they perform the same work, same activities, but the women always they get low paid than the men.
So this is the difference between status and role. And the next is condition and position, right? So condition is the material circumstances in which women and men live. Like as you said, the practical gender needs can be not equated, but it is related to the condition, the material circumstances. Whether, like, that women are primarily into agricultural sector, but they do not have access to any credit. They hardly have access to training program, skill development programs.
And also whatever the innovations, new equipments,
it is again owned by the men, or it has been accessible by the men, but not the women. So the material circumstances under which women are working, like how female, there is, male migration is there, out migration from the rural to the urban area, right? And at the same time, female headed household. But how women are actually, like female headed household, most of them are into the poverty line.
The like poverty among female headed household is very high.
Very high.
And also poverty among women are very high.
Very high. So this is actually the condition, the material circumstances it explains, right?
So condition is basically talks about the material
circumstances. And the last one is position, the place of women in the society. And as you know, always Sherry Otner also, argues that women are universally subordinated, right? And because universally women are seen as a subordinated being than the vis-a-vis men. So this is the kind of position, and which has come to this label because of the material circumstances where women they live, it is underprivileged, or it is in disadvantaged position, right? So, and in this, if you further explain this concept of condition and position, you can always use intersectionality framework, right? Gender in relation to caste, class, ethnicity, religion, and you could also see how women's relation in a particular religion, in a particular caste, in a particular class position, or within an ethnic group, it differs, it varies. So women are heterogeneous in nature in that sense. So these are the basic key concepts that gender analysis actually emphasizes the researcher or the students to understand before they go into the detail what is gender analysis. And now I would request Uma, if you could explain what is gender analysis and how it categorizes different policies.
Yes, I will explain you what is gender analysis. Gender analysis basically explores and highlights the relationship of women and men in the society and the inequalities in those relations by asking who does what work and who has what, who decides, how, who gains, and who uses. When we pose these questions, we also ask which men, which women. Okay, these are the questions they ask. Basically, gender analysis is to understand the who does what activities and who possess. It's like it's break down the divide between the public space and the private space. Okay, and in public space also, private space also, who decides and which and the relationship between the men and women, how it really operates in the society. And relationship means basically a power relations between the men and women, and also who holds the wealth, who decides at the community level, market, national and international level. All these places. So basically gender analysis try to understand these how these gender relations operates in the society. Once we understand how these gender relations operate in the society, then we can able to bring changes by formulating certain policies and programs. Using these definitions, there are certain frameworks. Before we explain the gender analysis framework,
it will be good for the viewers and particularly our learners of gender and development studies and women's and gender studies to know how we can actually categorize different policies, like blind policies.
Actually, that's why basically gender analysis policies and programs they formulated and implemented, that will have a certain impact on the lives of the
women and men
differently. So gender analysis, before we explain the framework, I will explain the certain policies, different types of policies. Like for example, first we'll start with gender blind policies. Like our students, viewers and listeners, after listening that different types of policies, they can easily make out the government policies also,
whether it is
which category this particular policy
or the programs
can come under. Okay, for gender blind policies, that it doesn't recognize the distinction between the sexes. They assume that certain policies and programs
gender is neutral
in favor of both. It's like bias, and that it is the bias towards the existing gender relations. Okay, second one is gender aware policies. In this gender aware policies, they recognize that both men and women are the development actors, and that nature of the women's involvement is determined by the gender relations. Okay, but gender aware policies, it awares that there is an unequal relationship
between women and men in the society.
There is an unequal relationship between the men and women's, and they address the women's needs also accordingly. Gender neutral policy is that it recognizes that there is a bias, but they implement the policies assuming that policies certainly bring changes in the lives
society
of the both men and women. That is the gender neutral policies. They assume.
Policy makers, they assume.
There is a difference, they accept. But they assume that this policy will bring changes in the lives of the both men and women. Gender specific policy is that they formulate this certain specific policy.
Like gender budgeting would be an example of gender specific policy.
Gender specific policy, we can give that example, because that they allocate the certain percentage to address the either needs of the men and women. Gender budgeting is not about the allocating the not about preparing the separate budget for men and women. It's not that. In that budget itself, for example, education, they allocate the certain 30% or 20%, 10% to address only needs of the male or female. Okay, that is the, so they formulate specific policies to address the needs of the either male or female.
For example, like Ujjwala scheme.
Ujjwala scheme. That scheme is only to reduce the drudgery
of women.
Okay, so gender redistributive policy is to transform the existing gender relations or power relations, and they want to create the more balanced relationship between women and men. Okay, and touching the strategic gender needs, what we were discussing.
Particularly, this example of workplace harassment.
That is the thing.
Sexual harassment policy.
Equal Pay Act.
Equal Pay Act.
Okay, after that only even Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Scheme, both men and women they are getting the equal wages.
Wages.
Okay, so this really that will alter the gender relations in at the rural areas. People start recognizing the women's activities because both men and women they performing the same activities, so on same wages they are getting. Okay, these are to alter the gender relations. That is called
The
existing gender relations.
So
they
bring
want.
transformation
Yes.
by forming certain gender sensitive policies and also law. For example, 2005, the Succession Act, Hindu Succession Act.
So women now
This
they have
can be an
equally they
example.
get the ancestral property.
Yes,
like men.
they are part of the women are the co-personary of the Hindu joint family.
Okay.
So these are the it can be example of
gender redistributive policies. Now to listeners they will understand what is gender analysis, concepts related to gender analysis. I think let us start giving the little bit about the frameworks.
Okay, what is the implication of gender analysis framework? One implication is context analysis, visualization and planning, then communication and monitoring and evaluation. So context, it helps when we apply gender analysis framework, it helps us to analyze the social context. Then visualization and planning, very well we can visualize the situation and plan accordingly.
Okay.
Then communication, it's a two-way communication between the beneficiaries vis-a-vis the policymakers or the project managers. And monitoring and evaluation, every policies need to be
monitored and
evaluated so that gender needs or perspectives can be addressed, right? And on these basis there are three primary frameworks. One is Harvard Analytical Framework, people centric oriented planning framework, and Moser's framework.
Okay.
So these three frameworks, like Harvard Analytical Framework looks at the economic needs of the women and men.
Okay.
And the people-centric framework, which was developed in the year 1992, and Harvard framework was developed in 1985, and people-centric framework was developed in 1992, which is particularly addressing the women and men's needs in a refugee situation.
Okay.
Like now in the context of conflict and disaster also, we can use POP framework.
Okay.
And Moser framework talks about the triple burden, the concept of work burden, which we have already explained in our concepts. The productive role, reproductive role, and the community role. Maybe today, because we are running out of time, so
Moser roles and gender relations
are primarily focused by the Moser framework.
Okay.
So we will stop our discussion here. Maybe in our future programs certainly we would come and focus
only on
the frameworks and its implementation in the field. So today, in our the second part of our discussion focused on what does what are the key concepts of gender analysis, then what are the different policies which can be categorized as from gender blind to gender redistributive policies, and the primary gender analysis frameworks which are largely been used in the development sector to bring about change.
Before I complete, just I give you one quick example. There is among the fishermen community, there is a small project and they want to improve the livelihoods of the women, and they provided only benefits to the women, and after they getting the financial benefits, they are not able to get the fish from the men in the market to sell, because when they implement the project, they didn't realize didn't consider the men's role in the entire fishing industries. Okay, so these frameworks.
So that is a role conflict
here. So all these frameworks really not only formulate the policies, how these policies are implemented, what type of impact it has created on the men and women. Okay, so learners and listeners, today you must have understood what is gender analysis and its related concepts. In the next session, we can explain more about the gender analysis framework.
Which is a practical tools to conduct gender analysis research, related research. And thank you so much for listening to us, and hope you must have benefited from our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, listeners.